I have written another article for New Eastern Outlook. It is titled, U.S.-Israel Inch Toward Wider, More Dangerous War. And when I wrote this, and as I am recording this video, Israel has yet to carry out its promised retaliation against Iran. Iran's missile strikes on Israel earlier this month, the very beginning of October. But again, Iran did not attack Israel out of the blue. It was only after serial provocations by Israel, the decapitation of Hezbollah's leadership, including Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah. This follows a strike on the Iranian consulate. This was earlier this year. In April, Iran retaliated against that. And so there has been this steady march toward war by the United States and its Israeli proxies against Iran. They were using October 7th, 2023, the Hamas attack against Israeli-held territory, as a pretext to trigger a much wider conflict with Iran and its allies. And as I pointed out many times before, Hamas has nothing to do with Iran and its allies. At one point, and for many years, they were literally fighting each other on the battlefield in Syria. And even though Iran does maintain ties to Hamas in terms of communication, diplomacy, there may be some factions, military factions within Hamas that Iran maybe supports, or factions within Iran may support. The organization itself is primarily backed and funded by U.S. Arab allies in the region, and it has been heavily infiltrated by Israel itself, and this is admitted. And Israel's current prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and I've pointed this out many times, the Israeli media reported on this, how he preferred to have Hamas in power. It created a perpetual pretext for war. It prevented the creation of a two-state solution, which is something that the U.S. and Israel do not want. So a two-state solution would put an end to the conflict. And that would put an end to the pretext the United States uses to maintain its military presence across the region. And just like North and South Korea, which I will be covering that in an upcoming article and video, the U.S. behind the scenes, very quietly but very obviously, is driving conflict. It is a strategy of tension meant to keep the U.S. in an area, to provide its dominance over the region, to create chaos within nations in the region and between nations of the region, to keep them weak and to allow the U.S. to maintain its primacy over them. This is imperialism 101. This is what has been done since ever there was empire. And this is a trick, a tactic, a strategy the U.S. still uses to this day. So let me read this article. And as always, I'm going to add additional information when necessary. I'm also going to show you the sources that I cited in this article. Beginning in October 2023, a renewed cycle of violence began destabilizing the Middle East. Hamas's October 7th, 2023 military operation into Israeli-held territory served as a pretext for Israel not to dismantle Hamas itself, but to conduct an indiscriminate, punitive military operation against all of Gaza. And I want to show you this article from The Guardian. This was October 10th, so just days after the October 7th operation, 2023. And it's titled, "We're Focused on Maximum Damage. Ground Offensive into Gaza Seems Imminent." And The Guardian is quoting IDF spokesman, Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, the spokesman for the Israeli military. Israel all but admitted as much, with Israeli Defense Forces spokesman Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari admitting thousands of tons of munitions had already been dropped on the tiny strip by October 10th, 2023, and that right now we're focused on what causes maximum damage. It is an admission to an indiscriminate military operation against all of Gaza. We remember Israeli politicians, even American politicians, vowing to flatten Gaza. It's a battle cry following the October 7th operations. While the Western media repeatedly refers to Hamas's October 7, 2023 attack as Iranian-backed, the West itself has admitted that Iran had no knowledge of the impending operation, let alone any role in it. And Again, look it up. There are articles like this in the Western media admitting as much. Initial U.S. intelligence suggests Iran was surprised by the Hamas attack on Israel. Again, the history of Hamas in relationship to Iran and its network of allies is one of conflict, hostilities, uneasy truces. Iran supports the Palestinian people and their right to resist illegal Israeli occupation as defined by the UN under international law. It understands that the Palestinian people see Hamas superficially fighting Israel, and so they support Hamas. They understand how complicated that makes their job of supporting the Palestinian people without supporting Hamas, seeing how Hamas is actually a proxy and extension of U.S.-Israeli aggression. This is exactly what I say in the article. This resembles deliberate attempts by the U.S. to infer Iraqi culpability regarding the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on the U.S., despite officially admitting Iraq played no role, all to serve as a partial pretext for the eventual U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq from 2003 onward. And the U.S. is still in Iraq to this day. Now, people who lived through that will remember the Western media repeatedly trying to link Iraq to the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, even though officially the U.S. said Iraq had nothing to do with it. Unofficially, they deliberately inferred that they did. And this was to create a false pretext alongside false claims of weapons of mass destruction being in Iraq to justify the invasion and occupation of Iraq. Omitted from the deliberately deceptive narratives trying to link Iran to Hamas is the fact that Hamas has a long-standing history of serving as an extension of U.S. aggression in the region rather than serving as a bulwark against it. 2012, this article that I repeatedly show people from Reuters, February 2012, Hamas ditches Assad, backs Syrian revolt. And in many ways, Syria was not close allies with Hamas. They were close allies with the Palestinian people. And if they were in any shape, form, or way supporting Hamas, it was because Hamas was the only organization even superficially fighting against Israel in any meaningful way. Hamas has branched out from the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood was the foundation upon which the U.S. built its proxy war against Syria from 2011 onward, and had used the Muslim Brotherhood for decades before that to try to destabilize and overthrow the Syrian government, including Bashar al-Assad, President Bashar al-Assad's father. So in 2012, Hamas publicly announced that it would mobilize against the Syrian government on the side of US-backed and armed militants. For years, Hamas fighters would play a role in fighting the Syrian government and its Iranian, Russian, and Hezbollah allies. They are fighting on behalf of the US and a conflict that Israel, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates all played a role in assisting the US in. Very important to keep that in mind. And people will say, well, that was a long time ago. Something like this, this type of service as an extension of US foreign policy in the region, you cannot find something similar like this in, say, Hezbollah or Ansar Allah's history. This is something unique to Hamas and other organizations and terrorist groups that have branched off from the Muslim Brotherhood. For years, Hamas has worked in tandem with Israel itself to frustrate efforts to establish a two-state solution, perpetuating hostilities and serving as a continuous pretext for continued Israeli aggression. And again, I have reported on this before. I've showed how even in the Israeli media, the fact that the Israeli government was deliberately supporting Hamas and trying to get it into power because it fit in with this wider plan to keep the conflict going. They do not want peace. They do not want peace between Israel and the Palestinians, or Israel and its neighbors, just like the US does not want peace on the Korean Peninsula. They do not want peace around the South China Sea. They do not want peace in Europe. And in each one of these regions, they are constantly fomenting conflict within nations and between nations. The ultimate goal of Israel's punitive operation against Gaza is to create an impossible dilemma for Iran and its allies, and eventually a permissive environment for wider conflict across the region. We could see this obviously taking shape. While Iran does not support Hamas, it supports the Palestinian people and their right to resist what the UN recognizes under international law as illegal Israeli occupation. And there is a UN Security Council resolution from 2016, 2334, and it describes the illegal Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory. It is Israel and its occupation of Palestinian territory, its rejection of a two-state solution, that is the central cause of this continuous conflict. You don't have to support Hamas to see what Israel is doing is wrong. How it is brutalizing the Palestinian people is likewise wrong. You don't have to support Hamas in order to do that. Iran and its allies, including Lebanon-based Hezbollah and Yemen-based Ansar Allah, referred to across the Western media as the Houthis, were compelled to assist the Palestinians. Note, assist the Palestinians, not Hamas. We do not see them rush to Hamas's aid. Hezbollah has since exchanged fire with Israeli military targets along the Israeli-Lebanese border, while Ansar Allah has conducted interdiction operations against Israeli-bound shipping through the Red Sea. And I believe that operation has expanded to include Israel's Western sponsors as well. Israel has used this as a pretext to escalate further, striking Iran's consulate in Syria on April 1st, 2024, and a series of terrorist attacks and targeted assassinations against Hezbollah, culminating in the death of Hezbollah's Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah. And when I'm talking about terrorist attacks, I'm referring to the pager terrorist attack. That was not targeting Hezbollah militants. It was targeting relief workers, medical workers, ambulance drivers. Both escalations were met by Iranian retaliation. Iran conducted a large-scale attack on Israel using standoff weapons, including drones, cruise missiles, and long-range ballistic missiles in mid-April, and a larger ballistic missile strike in early October. Both strikes were conducted with considerable restraint. The mid-April strike was preceded by Iranian warnings providing the US and Israel days to prepare. And this allowed the US and Israel to set up a network to meet and intercept the vast majority of these incoming targets. It was designed to send a warning to Israel. A small number of ballistic missiles, a relatively small number of ballistic missiles were used. They made it through these defenses, even though they had days to prepare them. And this was a message to Israel that we can conduct a much larger ballistic missile attack that will cause much greater damage if you persist. And that is exactly what happened at the beginning of this month, October, with the second Iranian ballistic missile strike. So the second strike, although conducted on short notice and involving a larger number of ballistic missiles, was designed to demonstrate Iran's ability to penetrate Israeli air defenses rather than to maximize damage. At every juncture, Iran has resisted escalation and conflict only to face further US-Israeli escalation. This should come as no surprise, as the most recent cycle of violence is part of long-standing US plans to provoke a wider war with Iran. And we saw the same process play out with the US provoking war with Russia, first in 2008 with Georgia, and then 2014 onward with Ukraine. The US is playing the same game with China in the Asia-Pacific region. It continuously provokes China, looking for a conflict sooner rather than later. It sees the world pivoting away from its US-led unipolar world order to a multipolar world order. It is trying to reassert itself, reassert American primacy before that pivot is complete, before it is irreversible. So let's talk about the policy paper that lays all of this out explicitly. This is the 2009 Brookings Institution paper, Which Path to Persia? Options for a New American Strategy Toward Iran. And there are policy papers like this addressing every targeted nation the US has on its very long list of nations targeted for regime change. It has papers like this regarding Russia, also China. I have referred to the Rand Corporation paper from 2019 extending Russia. Very similar options laid out. As a matter of fact, before I continue reading my article, let's just look at the table of contents and see what type of strategies the US has for regime change in Iran. So it talks about an overview of US policy options towards Iran, dissuading Iran, the diplomatic options, offer Iran shouldn't refuse persuasion. And they talk about essentially the nuclear deal that they would use to persuade the world that the US was trying to be reasonable and give Iran a way out. And they admit that they were never going to uphold it. They would violate it, they would blame it on Iran, and they would use that as a pretext for renewed sanctions and military pressure. Let's continue. Let's see what other options. The military option, going all the way. The Asarok option, airstrikes targeting Iran's nuclear program. I would say also their ballistic missile program at this point. And then Chapter 5, an entire chapter dedicated to using Israel as a proxy to wage war on Iran at their own expense and for America's benefit. Leave it to Bibi, allowing or encouraging an Israeli military strike. There's also the Velvet Revolution, supporting a popular uprising. This is the color revolution model the US has used all over the world for decades and decades, inspiring an insurgency, supporting Iranian minority and opposition groups. And in that, they include terrorist organizations listed by the US government as terrorist organizations. They suggest using listed terrorist organizations to as proxies against Iran to destabilize and overthrow the government. They also talk about military coups, but they talk about how unlikely that is. And then if all else fails, containment, encirclement and containment, which is kind of where we are right now. We're somewhere between the temptation to go all out militarily against Iran and then accepting containment, which they say accepting the unacceptable. Let me continue reading my article now, because I'm going to take two important quotes from that Chapter 5, Leave It to Bibi, allowing or encouraging an Israeli military strike. It says, the Brookings Institution's 2009 paper, Which Path to Persia? Options for a New American Strategy Toward Iran, in regards to carrying out strikes on Iran's nuclear program, explicitly stated it would be far more preferable if the United States could cite an Iranian provocation as justification for the airstrikes before launching them. Clearly, the more outrageous, the more deadly, and the more unprovoked the Iranian action, the better off the United States would be. Of course, it would be very difficult for the United States to goad Iran into such a provocation without the rest of the world recognizing this game, which would then undermine it. They admit all throughout the paper, Iran does not want war with either the US or with Israel. The US wants to control the entire region, but they cannot do so if there are nations like Iran with independent foreign policies. This is their only actual problem with Iran. Everything else about it being a threat to national security or regional stability is a lie, just like weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The paper would suggest using covert US-backed regime change operations to trigger an Iranian response the US could then cite as a sufficient Iranian action. Within the paper, an entire chapter was dedicated to using Israel as a proxy to trigger a wider war with Iran. Titled, Leave It to Bibi, allowing or encouraging an Israeli military strike, it would explain. As in the case of American airstrikes against Iran, the goal of this policy option would be to destroy key Iranian nuclear facilities, or at this point, ballistic missile production, perhaps. However, in this case, in the hope that doing so would significantly delay Iran's acquisition of an indigenous nuclear weapons capability. However, in this case, an added element could be that the United States would encourage and perhaps even assist the Israelis in conducting the strikes themselves, in the expectation that both international criticism and Iranian retaliation would be deflected away from the United States and onto Israel, which is exactly what the US is using Ukraine for in its war, proxy war against Russia. It does not want to fight Russia directly. It does not want American soldiers dying, does not want any sort of direct consequences inflicted upon itself or even its interests in Europe or elsewhere around the world. It wants Ukraine to pay the full price, and it wants to reap the full benefits from the proxy war, which is exactly what they're doing right now in Ukraine. They are fighting Russia completely at the expense of Ukraine. And their plan in the Middle East is to use Israel at its own expense to the full benefit of the United States and its foreign policy objectives in the region. It is abundantly clear that a variation of this strategy is now in play, with Israel elected as an eager proxy, provoking Iran up the ladder of escalation, leading to an opportunity for Israel to carry out dramatic strikes on Iran itself, and possibly precipitate a wider regime change war Washington has sought for years. There, however, exists significant complications. Let's talk about these complications. The limits to not only Israeli military power, but U.S. military power, which should be abundantly obvious to you if you have been following my coverage of the conflict in Ukraine. My primary focus is on military industrial production on both sides and how a superior military industrial base in Russia has tilted the conflict in Russia's favor. So let's see how those dynamics play out regarding this conflict in the Middle East the U.S. seeks to wage, again, through a proxy, Israel in this case. Iran's most recent missile strike on Israel has demonstrated an ability to penetrate Israeli air defenses on a significant scale. According to The Telegraph, this article here, Iran has proved it can breach the world's greatest air defense system. What comes next could be devastating. The world is taking notes after Israel's formidable Iron Dome was breached by Iranian rockets. That's a little bit of a misnomer. The article does explain that Israel has layered air defenses. The Arrow 3, the longest range anti-ballistic missile system they have, David Sling, which is somewhere in between, and the Iron Dome is for much shorter ranges. And it's actually designed to take out the small handful of rockets and missiles that, say, Hamas or Hezbollah launch that are actually headed toward any sort of critical target, because everything else the Iron Dome disregards and allows to hit the desert or to fall into the ocean. It does not waste interceptors on targets that are not going to hit anything critical. And that is how they have been able to effectively parry these rocket and missile barrages, because they are large scale, but they are inaccurate, and the vast majority of the incoming targets do not hit anything important. So according to The Telegraph, in an article titled, "Iran has proved it can breach the world's greatest air defense system. What comes next could be devastating." Over 24 missiles reached their targets, overwhelming Israel's layered air defenses. The article explains Israeli defenses consist of the Iron Dome, David Sling, and Arrow 3 missiles, each dealing with incoming targets at increasingly distant ranges. I would suggest that they also deal with different types of incoming targets. 24 missiles of 180 launched, making it through Israeli defenses, may indicate Israeli defense systems have an 86% success rate, or that not enough systems exist to launch enough interceptors to deal with barrages of this size, or possibly a combination of the two. Either way, it reveals one aspect of the limits of Israeli defenses. Another problem exists for Israeli air defenses, regardless of their capabilities. The quantity of interceptors in stockpiles and the annual production rate of additional interceptors versus Iranian stockpiles and annual production of ballistic missiles could leave Israel increasingly vulnerable to successive waves of Iranian missile strikes. Many of Israel's air defense missiles were developed and are jointly made with the United States. The U.S. suffers from chronically low military industrial capacity for critical hardware like air defense systems, radars, anti-armor missiles, and even items as simple as artillery shells. This includes the production of the Patriot Air Defense System and the THAAD, which stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Anti-Ballistic Missile System. It is highly likely that production of interceptors for Israel's systems suffer from similar limits to production. I have not seen the production rates of these missiles. I think I have seen the production rate of the Iron Dome, and it is sufficient to deal with these large-scale but very inaccurate barrages from Hamas or Hezbollah every couple of years. But beyond that, no, it will be overwhelmed and their stockpiles exhausted. Washington's other proxy war in Ukraine has exposed critical shortcomings of U.S. military-industrial production, but shortages of Patriot missiles began even before Russia launched its special military operation in February 2022, demonstrating just how limited U.S. production is. And I linked to this article, and I've talked about this in regards to Ukraine many times. This was from January 2022, so a month before Russia launched its special military operation. Saudi Arabia may run out of interceptor missiles in months. And they're talking about how they requested more missiles from the US, who had none to spare, had to borrow missiles from neighboring countries in the Persian Gulf. And now the US has sent huge numbers of both Patriot missile systems and interceptors to Ukraine. They cannot make enough missiles. They will never make enough missiles to deal with even one of these conflicts, let alone the many conflicts the US is provoking and fighting by proxy around the globe. So what is being done about, is anything being done about this? I've cited reports about the expansion of Patriot missile production from 500 to 550 missiles, and by 2027, 600 to 650 missiles. But again, when you consider the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, I will get into the number of ballistic missiles Iran is believed to have in the Middle East, and then China's much larger missile arsenal, it will never be enough. It doesn't even come close to enough. So let's read on. More recently, Israeli media reported the possible deployment of US THAAD batteries to Israel to bolster Israeli air defenses ahead of planned Israeli strikes on Iran and the anticipated Iranian retaliation to follow. While THAAD batteries could play a role in enhancing Israeli defenses, it would be temporary. So here's the article that I was referring to. October 12, 2024, US deploys anti-ballistic missiles to Israel. Iran says no red lines. And then more recently, a day later, the Pentagon confirmed that they were deploying THAAD missile systems to Israel, but they said a THAAD battery. So I wrote my article when I didn't know how many batteries were going. I considered several scenarios, including what if the US sent all of its THAAD batteries, which is entirely unlikely. But let's just say that they did. Would it even be enough if they sent every single battery they had? So let's continue reading. The US has only 7 existing batteries, each with between 6 to 9 launchers, for a total of between 42 to 63 launchers. That is in total, all of the launchers the US has in its possession, 42 to 63, depending on how many launchers are in each battery. Each launcher holds 8 missiles at the ready. An entire battery would have between 48 to 72 missiles at the ready. If all 7 batteries were transferred to Israel, which is highly unlikely, and now we know only 1 battery is being transferred, this would mean 336 to 504 missiles were at the ready, assuming all batteries were fully operational at full strength. Standard operating procedure often requires 2 interceptors launched at any single incoming target to increase the probability of success, meaning that all 7 batteries would be capable of targeting between 168 to 252 incoming targets, or approximately the number of ballistic missiles Iran launched in its early October missile strikes, 180. So that falls in between the total number of missiles the US could launch at any one time if all 7 batteries were in Israel. Now, here's where it gets grim for the US and for its Israeli proxies. This from late 2023, from Lockheed Martin, a press release. Lockheed Martin delivers 800th THAAD interceptor. They have been manufacturing THAAD missiles since, I believe, somewhere around 2008. So from 2008 to the end of 2023, they have produced 800. Now, I'm not entirely sure if those 800 missiles are just those Lockheed Martin delivered to the United States or in total. I saw Alexander Mercouris from the Duran claim he saw sources indicating there could be up to 1,000 missiles. There are only 2 other operators of the THAAD missile system, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. According to this Breaking Defense article, the US signed a contract with Saudi Arabia to sell 44 launchers and 360 missiles. So I think between 800 and 1,000 missiles could be out there. But as you can see, it's not a lot of missiles. It really is not. So the production rate is probably between 50 to 60. And they're talking about how the missiles have to be jointly produced by Saudi Arabia because Lockheed Martin simply doesn't have enough capacity to produce all these missiles themselves. And they have demonstrated that with the Patriot missile system, their inability to produce enough Patriot missiles to meet demand, which is why now you hear about Germany and Japan producing them, but they've had all kinds of problems doing that. Whatever the total number of THAAD missiles ever produced actually is, whether it's 800 or 1,000, it really doesn't matter. Those missiles were all produced. Missiles are used in training. Missiles become inoperable because they've been sitting around and they need to be refurbished. And they've been used operationally. So Lockheed has only produced approximately 800, let's say 800 to 1,000 missiles for THAAD since production began in 2008, meaning that US THAAD batteries could only defend against approximately 2 to 3 additional Iranian missile strikes. So let's just say we're only talking about US THAAD systems. And let's just say the total number of missiles they have ever had access to is 800. If they had all 800 missiles on hand, and all 7 batteries were in Israel right now, they would only be able to deal with 2 to 3 more missile barrages from Iran. But this assumes all 800 missiles produced are still on hand. They are not. Missiles are spent annually on training, and missiles have been used operationally, including in 2022 by the United Arab Emirates against a missile and drone attack by Ansar Allah, based in Iran. So let's take a look at that. This was 2022. Defense News: THAAD in first operational use destroys mid-range ballistic missile, singular, in Houthi attack. While THAAD reportedly intercepted a ballistic missile during the attack, other missiles and drones managed to get through, striking targets, causing damage and casualties. And that was according to the United Arab Emirates itself. All of this casts doubts on efforts to bolster Israeli air defenses against successive waves of Iranian missiles if the US and its Israeli proxies continue seeking escalation. And Alexander Mikuris, as part of his discussion of the THAAD missile deployment to Israel, noting that only 1 battery was being sent, seemed to believe that it was more symbolic than anything else. I believe that it will enhance, at least temporarily, Israeli air defenses, but it's not going to stop significant damage from being done if Iran decides to launch a larger and additional waves of missile strikes against Israel. And of course, speaking of the quantity of missiles even available, there are not enough to defend against Iranian missile strikes in the long term if the US and its Israeli proxies insist on escalating. So conversely, Western sources, and this is according to articles like this from indisputably pro-Western media, the Wall Street Journal: how big is Iran's missile arsenal? More than 3,000 ballistic missiles. 3,000. Now, do all 3,000 have the ability to reach Israel? I don't know. But even if a third of them can reach Israel, that is a significant number of missiles the US and Israel are incapable of defending against. So conversely, Western sources claim Iran may have up to 3,000 missiles on hand. Reuters reported, so here's this article from earlier this year, July 8th, 2024, exclusive satellite photos show Iran expanding missile production by dozens of additional buildings and facilities. So reported earlier this year that Iran is believed to be expanding ballistic missile production even further. While many of these missiles may not have the ability to reach Israel, potentially hundreds could, and may be able to do so in much larger waves than demonstrated so far. Just as the US is discovering in Ukraine as Russian military-industrial production outpaces the collective West's, tilting the conflict in Russia's favor, Washington's proxy war against Iran runs the risk of its geopolitical reach exceeding its military-industrial grasp. And think about the type of air defense systems the US possesses and its allies and proxies possess. And Alexander Mikuris brought this very good point up as well during his recent discussion. The US, its air defense systems are a product of its military doctrine. The US, throughout recent history, is forward deployed everywhere. They maintain air superiority over any battlefield they're engaged on. They did not see the need to have extensive air defense systems. The Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation after it did. So does China, for that matter. They have developed huge numbers of missiles, air defense systems, other long-range weapon systems, artillery, all for anti-access area denial. They are not focused on projecting military power abroad. They are focused on creating anti-access area denial for encroaching Western forces. Their military hardware and the development of it over the decades reflects that. The Soviet Union and the Russian Federation have spent tremendous amounts of time and resources on developing superior air defense systems. The US has not. They don't have the quality or the quantity that Russia has in this area. Russia also excels in electronic warfare. I've talked about this for very similar reasons. Iran has developed a tremendous ballistic missile system, does not have the conventional military power to, say, invade Israel or to fight a vast ground war against the United States. So it has focused on another strength that it could cultivate, these ballistic missiles. It has used asymmetrical military power to protect itself from this encirclement that the US has engaged in, again, for decades. The use of Hezbollah and Ansar Allah and the Shia militias across Iraq and Syria have all been part of this asymmetrical military power Iran has cultivated. The US, its military power, its military hardware, its doctrine, was created in a time when it was waging war against nations like Iraq with antiquated, poorly trained, poorly motivated forces, where precision-guided weapons was something the US almost solely monopolized. That is no longer the case, and they have never adjusted their military, their industrial base, or their doctrine to reflect this. And now they're faced with this huge problem where they are provoking multiple massive wars around the globe with adversaries capable of inflicting serious damage on them with weapons they have no real answer to. And yet they are compelled to continue escalating anyway. The real danger lies in the dynamics spelled out in the 2009 Brookings paper and manifesting themselves through political theater unfolding now. So let's look at this article from relatively recently. Biden won't support a strike on Iran nuclear sites as Israel weighs response to Iran missile attack. That is the whole premise of this chapter. Leave it to Bibi allowing or encouraging Israeli military strike. The US has to pretend like it is totally against this so that when Israel carries it out, let's read the quote again. International criticism and Iranian retaliation would be deflected away from the United States and onto Israel. It is that simple and that obvious. Articles like this and statements like this from the United States. That is the entire purpose of the US making statements like this. They have been utterly obsessed for decades in attacking Iran, regime change in Iran, and preventing it from developing military capabilities that will change the balance of power in the Middle East as we see it changing now. This is setting Israel up as a rogue nation urged to exercise restraint by the US, but determined to resort to extreme measures unilaterally. Again, unilaterally. Allowing for military options the US could never justify itself and creating plausible deniability for Washington if and when such options are exercised. Among these military options could be extensive conventional military strikes by Israel against Iranian nuclear facilities, oil refineries, and elements of its missile production lines. Iranian retaliation could trigger wider hostilities the US could then use to justify military intervention or possibly allow Israel to justify the use of its alleged nuclear arsenal. Israel supposedly has a large number of nuclear weapons. The window of opportunity for the US to use its Israeli proxy in the Middle East before the region and the world completely pivots away from a reality where the US is the dominant superpower on Earth. The temptation to use Israel and its nuclear arsenal and this game that the US has been building up toward for years and years, portraying Israel as a mad dog they cannot control. The temptation to have them use nuclear weapons and say, well, we tried to stop them. We told them, don't strike Iranian nuclear sites. We didn't even want them to strike oil production facilities. We wanted peace in the Middle East, and it was Israel and Israel alone that did it. Again, that was the entire point of writing this chapter here. It is the same mentality that has the US waging war against Russia using Ukraine, and it's the same mentality the US is using, deferring to, as it sets Taiwan up as a proxy against the rest of China. They're also setting up the entire nation of the Philippines as a proxy against China the Philippines' largest, most important trade partner. The ultimate objective would be to neutralize Iranian military capabilities, create the conditions in which regime change could be attempted, and the emergence of a significant weak point along Russia and China's peripheries the US could then exploit vis-a-vis Moscow and Beijing more directly. Again, look at a map. The US is trying to encircle Eurasia, and at the core of Eurasia is Russia, China, and Iran. U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, again, you have to remember that this is the plan. This has always been the plan since the end of the Cold War. U.S. strategy plan calls for ensuring no rivals develop. The classified document makes the case for a world dominated by one superpower whose position can be perpetuated by constructive behavior and sufficient military might to deter any nation or group of nations from challenging American primacy. That was the plan then. That is openly what the plan is today. The U.S. repeatedly talks about maintaining leadership over the international order. It refers to Russia and China as revisionists, attempting to overturn this order. It is this single geopolitical objective that has driven U.S. foreign policy, whether it's in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, or anywhere across Asia. As prospects for U.S. success in Ukraine dim, and as China continues to surpass the U.S. militarily in the Asia-Pacific, the temptation to resort to drastic measures regarding Iran in the Middle East will grow, especially under the cover of plausible deniability, using Israel as a willing proxy provides. At the time of this writing, Israel has not yet carried out its next round of provocations against Iran. Only time will tell exactly when and how Israel will proceed and how the U.S. will exploit the plausible deniability it has crafted for itself along the way. Much that follows will depend on Iran's ability to protect its conventional missile forces, continue utilizing the leverage they provide, and successfully manage escalation with the U.S. and its Israeli proxies. Short of extreme measures on Washington and Israel's part, Iran will likely continue cultivating a large and growing strategic advantage. Because of this, however, the likelihood of the U.S. and/or Israel, which still includes the U.S., resorting to extreme measures grows. And that is what I am worried about. I think that's what many people should be worried about. The U.S. sees global hegemony slipping away. It sees failure in Ukraine. It sees the rise of China outpacing any attempt it has made to try to keep up. It sees the Middle East as perhaps one opportunity. And you have to remember, all of these areas are linked. What the U.S. does to Russia affects China. What the U.S. does to Iran is going to affect Russia and China. Disrupting, upturning order in the Middle East would affect hydrocarbons, oil that China depends on economically. So they're not doing this just as a desperate bid to have a win. They understand the impact this will have in trying to improve the odds for themselves elsewhere, their ambitions elsewhere. We have to be very careful about this. We have to keep a very close eye on this, and we have to understand that what is happening in the Middle East is another version of what the U.S. is doing in Europe and the Asia-Pacific region. I have so many people repeatedly tell me that I'm completely wrong about Israel. Israel controls the United States. This is what I am told. A country with 1/35 the population of the U.S., about 9 million people, about the population of New York and the surrounding areas, and 1/50th the GDP of the United States, and completely dependent on billions of dollars worth of military aid every single year, arms and ammunition that Israel could not continue fighting without. Somehow, a nation this small and this dependent on the U.S. controls the U.S. And when I ask them how that could possibly be true, they tell me AIPAC. AIPAC controls the U.S. And I'm very glad that people are aware of lobbying and the fact that it exerts influence on Washington. But AIPAC is not the only lobbying effort taking place in Washington. There are literally hundreds of lobbying efforts taking place in Washington, spending vastly more on influencing Washington than AIPAC will ever have access to. The arms industry alone spends by far more than AIPAC ever will, has ways of influencing Washington that AIPAC does not. We have to understand that these think tanks, the Brookings Institution, even though it probably does include people who are particularly sympathetic to Israel, ultimately is funded not just by the arms industry, but by the oil industry, banks, pharmaceutical corporations, big agriculture. The largest corporate financier interests across the West fund these think tanks. So it's not just an arms industry cartel, it is a cartel of entire industries funding these think tanks, arriving at consensus, producing policy papers exactly like this, which are then turned into policies and bills that go to Washington, are signed off on, and then sent to the Western media to sell to the American people. That is how it works. And Israel and its lobbyists are a tiny little fraction of all of that. Israel is indistinguishable from Ukraine. Everything that the US does for Israel, it is doing for Ukraine right now. As a matter of fact, when this all started with Ukraine, I had hoped that people obsessed with this idea that somehow Israel controls the US, they would see the relationship being built between the US and Ukraine, and they would realize, wait a minute, that's what the US has done with Israel. Israel is a proxy of the US, it's not controlling the US. You know, Benjamin Netanyahu comes to Congress and people give him standing ovations. They are giving President Volodymyr Zelensky standing ovations. People are meant to pledge loyalty to Ukraine, and if they don't, they're condemned and ridiculed. And if you do likewise for Israel, the same thing happens. Israel has the advantage of having been a much longer standing proxy of the US and a much more successful proxy of the US. If Ukraine were able to hold on for several decades, have better success against Russia, by this time, 2-3 decades from now, Ukraine will command the same image of dominating US foreign policy as Israel does right now. But I assure you, it is the other way around. You have a proxy, you place your proxy between yourself and danger. If Israel truly controlled the United States, the entirety of America's military power would be in the Middle East, placed between Israel and its adversaries. Instead, it is divided in Ukraine, Asia, and the Middle East. And that is because the US is waging proxy war in all three regions. As a proxy in each region, Israel is its proxy in the Middle East. It is really that simple. And unless you can show me the receipts to suggest otherwise, if you could show me Israeli influence, political and economic power greater than just America's arms industry, maybe you'll change my mind. Until then, no. And this is what we have to keep an eye on. This dangerous proxy war the US is waging in the Middle East. It's extremely dangerous proxy Israel, who does have access to nuclear weapons, and who the United States is investing a lot in distancing itself from at the moment. This is an incredible danger we have to keep an eye out for. I will continue keeping an eye out for it. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. Absolutely everything I do goes up on Telegram. I back up all of my videos on Rumble. In case my YouTube channel disappears, you can find me on Rumble and on Telegram. In the video description of every single video are all the links to the articles that I'm reading, everything that I'm citing, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. It's not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you don't have the resources and you're simply sharing my work with others, all of that is greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.